Hi, I'm Rob, a Washington, D.C. tour guide. I'm here at Dupont Circle, and I want to take you on a virtual tour around the neighborhood. So let's turn the camera around and get started.
And we're off. Let's take a stroll around the Dupont Circle neighborhood here in Washington, D.C. Over the next 35 to 40 minutes, I'll show you around, tell you a little bit about the history of the area, show you some hotels where you can stay nearby, things to do, your transportation options, and maybe even a few places to eat and hang out. But let's start by leaving the fountain area of Dupont Circle. And if you're wondering why I'm calling it a fountain, despite the fact that there was no water there, don't worry, we'll get there, we'll cover that. But for now, when someone refers to the Dupont Circle fountain, they're referring to the center area of this traffic circle, where you can hang out. There were plenty of people hanging out today. By the way, if you're new around here, my name is Rob. I'm a Washington, D.C. tour guide, and I've been giving live tours of Washington, D.C. for well over a decade. I've been working on creating some of these virtual tours here on YouTube to show you around in a little bit different way as well. So if you like what you see here and you want to see even more of my virtual tours, I currently have a bunch. I've done virtual tours of the cherry blossoms, of the wharf, the Navy Yard on a Washington Nationals baseball game day. I've even done the National Mall at midnight. And if you want to see even more of these, leave a comment and let me know that you like these. And if you have a suggestion about another place where I can go, leave that comment and let me know. Okay, we are now passing the Dupont Circle Metro entrance on the south side, and I just showed Swingers, a business across the street that is a little indoor mini golf place in the basement of a big office building. And I've actually not been to it as a paying customer. When I'm on social media, I see so many ads for that place, Swingers. So I'm not really sure, I can't vouch for it personally yet, but I do see a ton of ads for it. So I feel like everyone has probably been contacted by now to make one. Here's Aloha Poke. One of my favorite foods is poke, which is Hawaiian. And I learned somewhat recently from a guest on one of my tours from Hawaii that poke translates from Hawaiian, roughly translates as cubed items. So a lot of people think of poke as fish, similar to sushi or what you can get in Japan. And they share some similarities, but poke does not have to be fish. It does not have to be raw fish. It just has to be cubed items. So it's a good option for fish enjoyers like myself, and also vegetarians like many people that I know. So let me tell you about today, the day I'm visiting the Dupont Circle area. It's a Friday afternoon. It's May. There is great, fantastic spring weather today. It is 75 degrees. There's low humidity. There's little breeze. We don't get a lot of very nice days in Washington, D.C., but I would say today is about as good as it gets. Across the street, that building with the blue patio area, that is Colada Shop. A nice little Cuban restaurant, cafe, coffee shop. If you've watched my virtual tour around the wharf, I also pointed out their location at the wharf as well. So a lot of these local chains, they will have multiple locations in multiple areas. And while I'm not a huge fan of chain restaurants myself, a local chain I could definitely get behind, because if they do have multiple locations, well, it must be at least a little good. So we're going to walk around the Dupont Circle neighborhood. What is this person doing? And of course, it wouldn't be a walk around Washington, D.C. without some reckless driving, some poor driving, and we'll see. Probably that won't be the last one that we'll see. That is perhaps one of my greatest frustrations with being a walker, a pedestrian in Washington, D.C. is, yeah, it can be a little annoying to have to dodge stuff like that. So let me go ahead and cross the street, because the next turn I want to make is coming up on O Street. But like I said, today is a beautiful spring day. It's May. May, in my opinion, has the most consistently spring-like weather in DC. So in April, during cherry blossom bloom, you can get a nice day. You can also get a very cold day. And in June, you can sometimes get a nice day. You can also get a very hot day. So it's very rare to have very nice days. Today is one of them. That's the Hurok House across the street with the big green, what do you call that? Not a dome, but the big green top on it. The Hurok House, it's a museum. It's also known as the Brewmaster's Castle. It does look pretty castle-like now that I think of it. It was originally owned by Christian Hurok, a German-American beer brewer. Its current use is as a museum and a cultural center. It was, at one time, the Hurok Brewing Company, and it was the largest brewery in all of Washington, D.C. Across the street, in that little tiny triangle, is a little park. Even locals don't really know about this. It's called Sonny Bono Park. It's what we call a tiny pocket park, and a good example of a pocket park. I'm not going to cross the street and go look at it because it's not very big and it does look a bit overgrown. So I'm just going to continue on my planned route. But it was spearheaded by a DC real estate developer who was actually close friends with Bono. And under the park is a vault, a time capsule, if you will, with memorabilia including some sheet music from some of his tunes, as well as Bono's official congressional cufflinks. So there's some interesting history there, some interesting stuff down there. But I am on O Street now. I turned down O Street, and up here on the left, this red building. This is the mansion on O Street, also known as the O Street Museum. It's a fascinating place. It's a museum that is comprised of 5 interconnecting townhouses. It features over 100 rooms, and famously, it's more than 80 secret doors. So here's a little plaque for the O Street Mansion and for Rosa Parks. One of the most interesting things, in my opinion, about the O Street Museum is that it was functionally Rosa Parks' home, her residence, for about a decade, from 1994 to 2004. I believe at various points she called it a home away from home, and her room is there. So it's full of her personal artifacts, and it's part of the museum collection. The O Street Museum is also somewhat famous, in addition to the secret doors, for its themed rooms, which are kind of uniquely decorated rooms. Each room is different. They have one that's called the Log Cabin. They have the John Lennon Suite, the Safari Room, the Art Deco Penthouse, and of course Rosa Parks' residence as well. And I am a bit embarrassed to admit this, but I didn't know this when I was younger, when I was in school. We certainly learned about Rosa Parks and the civil rights era, Martin Luther King and the other civil rights leaders. And we learned about Rosa Parks on the bus and the bus boycotts in Montgomery. And I kind of thought that after the bus boycott was over that it was all happy life for Rosa Parks and she lived happily ever after, and that is very much not the case. There was a fantastic Rosa Parks exhibit at the Library of Congress years ago. Unfortunately, it was temporary and it's now gone, but it did go into great depth about her life and the fact that her and her husband were essentially run out of Alabama after what happened with the bus boycott. They lived in Michigan for a time, and then after he passed away, Rosa Parks lived at the mansion on O, the O Street Museum. So, fascinating piece of history, DC history, national history, civil rights history. Another interesting thing about the mansion on O Street is that everything inside is for sale. Now, it's not a free museum, and that's why if you're thinking, wow, I've never heard of this before, this sounds like a fascinating place that you're telling me about. Well, it's not a free museum, and in Washington, D.C., that means it often just gets ignored when people are planning trips. There are so many amazing free museums that you can go to that a paid museum often doesn't even make it onto the list. So if you're interested in art, if you're interested in quirky places, if you're interested in a fun experience where you get to find all those secret doors, yeah, check it out, or at least put it on your list of things to check out. It's not like the Air and Space Museum. It is a very different type of museum experience. But just because it's not free And just because it's not the most famous museum in town doesn't mean that it's not looking into. I've been talking a lot about that museum, and I walked past it a long time ago. So let's go ahead and turn up here. We're gonna make our way from O Street up to P Street. P Street is a little bit more of a commercial street in the neighborhood, and it's also where two of the hotels that I recommend are located, so I will point those out on the walk past so you can see where they are located. To my left, if you were to turn left on P Street, I'm going to turn right, but if you were to turn left, you would be able to walk to Georgetown. So I've done a neighborhood guide for Georgetown. I've also done a neighborhood guide for Dupont Circle. So if you're interested in the neighborhood, as we're walking around, if you think, wow, this place looks interesting, I'd like to know more about it, I have a dedicated video for Dupont Circle and for Georgetown. But Georgetown, its biggest disadvantage for tourists is that it's hard to get to. There's no metro station there, and so you either have to take the bus or you have to walk from another neighborhood. And many people walk from Foggy Bottom. There's a metro station there. Some people walk across the bridge from Roslyn in Arlington, Virginia. But you can also walk from Dupont Circle. So if you got off the metro at the Dupont Circle station, you could walk down P Street, and then you'd eventually make your way into Georgetown. So not a lot of people know that. Just want to point that out because it is a way that you can get there if it's a neighborhood that you're interested in visiting. So now we are on P Street. And like I said, this is a bit of a commercial area. But what I like so much about Dupont Circle is that it's kind of what I call an everything neighborhood. And what I mean by that is some neighborhoods are residential, some neighborhoods are commercial, some are full of office buildings, some are exclusively houses. And Dupont Circle kind of has a little bit of everything. It's got hotels, it's got businesses, it's got offices, it's got houses, it's got apartments, it's got condos, it's got restaurants, it's got bagels, etc. Up here on the right, one of the places in DC where you can get a pretty good bagel. Might not be New York City, but it's pretty good. So here's the Residence Inn, and this is one of my recommended places to stay. And so Residence Inn is kind of like a mid-tier hotel brand, I think. And across the way, across the street, currently to my left, was the Royal Sonesta. So two options on this street right across from each other, both close to the Circle, both close to Metro, close to transportation, close to Georgetown if that's where you want to be. And so not a bad location at all. And generally these are kind of mid-tier hotels, so they're not the least expensive, they're not the most expensive, they're pretty middle of the pack. And I know just from giving tours that that's often what kind of the average traveler is looking for. Nothing too fancy, but nothing too rundown either. Rundown's not the right word, but a good middle of the pack hotel, I think, is what most people are interested in. So we've got some restaurants, we've got some hotels, we've got a bookstore on this street. This is an interesting little street, and like I said, more commercial than some of the others. Later on in the walk, I'll take you down a residential street. I'll show you some of the famous Washington, D.C. row houses, and I'll talk a little bit about what it might be like to live in this neighborhood. Unfortunately, I've never lived in this neighborhood, but it is one of my favorites, and so happy to talk about it as much as I can. So let's back up, though, a little bit. Dupont Circle, what's the history of this neighborhood? Well, it was actually originally part of the L'Enfant plan for Washington, D.C. Let me go ahead and pop on, I'm going to edit on a map of the original L'Enfant city. So this is Washington, D.C. as L'Enfant planned it. It's much smaller than the current boundaries of Washington, D.C. And L'Enfant planned the streets, the avenues. Pennsylvania Avenue is probably the most famous one that you know of, but we also have, cutting through Dupont Circle, we have Connecticut Avenue and New Hampshire Avenue, and not too far away, Massachusetts Avenue, which I'll talk a little bit more in a bit. But here is Second Story Books, and this is a used bookstore. Bit of a play on words with the name, Second Story Books. Get it? Second Story Books. Yeah, okay, so anyway, there are a few decent used bookstores in DC, and if that's your kind of thing, I think you'll enjoy that. And there's another one in the Capitol Hill neighborhood. Maybe one day I'll do a virtual tour around in that area and show you that as well. So Dupont Circle was part of the original L'Enfant plan for Washington, D.C., but the circle, where I started the tour, was not really developed until around the time of the Civil War. So between the founding of the city and the Civil War, this area, Dupont Circle, was essentially rural farmland. Now I know to modern people, and including me, this is almost definitionally unbelievable to think that an area of the city this close to downtown would be farmland. Doesn't really make any sense. But anyway, I said that first person wouldn't be the first bad driver that we saw. Here's someone just parked right in the middle of the crosswalk, as one does. Anyway, I'll end my rant about that now. So this was farmland until it wasn't. Around the time of the Civil War, it started to get developed into more of a residential neighborhood. It is named for Rear Admiral Samuel Francis Dupont, who was a prominent naval officer. He served with distinction during both the Mexican-American War and the Civil War. And in 1882, Congress authorized the installation of a statue of Dupont in the middle of the circle to honor his naval service. There are many statues of military people all around D.C. Dupont was just one of them. That original statue was replaced decades later with the Dupont Fountain, which is a marble sculpture created by Daniel Chester French, who also happened to design the Lincoln Memorial statue. More on the fountain in a bit. So here's the northern entrance to the Dupont Circle station. So like many metro stations, Dupont Circle has multiple entrances, and in this case, they're actually quite far apart. So at the very beginning of the walk, I took you past the south entrance, and way up here is the north entrance. Now, the reason why they're so far apart is because Dupont Circle is quite a deep metro station. And I find this fascinating, sometimes endlessly fascinating, because only one stop away, the Farragut North Station, is one of the shallowest metro stations in the system. But between Farragut North and Dupont, the elevation change is quite significant, and that is because they basically had to build metro to tunnel underneath Rock Creek Park, which is where the National Zoo is located. It's a big urban park, but they didn't want the metro going into the park, so they had to tunnel under it, hence why the Dupont Circle station is so deep. Here's Kramer's. Kramer's was formerly known as Kramer Books. It is a bookstore. It's also a cafe, and it is, I think a lot of locals, a lot of folks who live in this neighborhood would call it an institution. And I don't use that word lightly, because I think a lot of things can be called an institution, kind of sloppily, but I think Kramer's definitely fits the definition. Oh, Foxtrot. We have a vacant storefront here that still has the Foxtrot branding on it. If you're not familiar, Foxtrot was a chain of, not really sure how else to describe it other than like a fancy convenience store. And they were all over DC. I believe they were in DC and Chicago. Chicago was like their world headquarters, and they were all over Chicago, and people in Chicago were obsessed with Foxtrot. And it was kind of humming along, and then one day there was this big hullabaloo because Foxtrot said every single store that we own is shut down effective immediately. And they basically told the people working there to lock the door and leave, and that was it. They were done. It was closed. They were out of a job. Just a very, very quick, unexpected situation, and unfortunately many of the Foxtrots are still vacant. And you will see they haven't even taken down the old branding. So we are now on Connecticut Avenue. This is another commercial corridor. So P Street, that had more of a mix of hotels and eateries and used bookstores. There's plenty of that here too on Connecticut Avenue. So those are kind of the two big commercial streets in the neighborhood. Connecticut Avenue also, unfortunately, can be a bit noisy from traffic. This is a major thoroughfare for driving, for traffic, and so unfortunately there's a lot of people driving fast, and it's loud, and yeah, it is what it is. So a little bit more history as we make our way over to, I think this is our street up here. So in the 19th and early 20th centuries, Dupont Circle became known as Washington, D.C.'s Millionaire's Row because of all the elaborate mansions and townhouses that were scattered about. And at the time, this is where people lived, where the well-to-do lived, and many of these historic homes are still standing. This is very much a historic district, but they now serve as embassies, cultural institutions, small office buildings, boutique hotels. The area here, like much of Washington, D.C., went through a bit of a decline in the mid-century, and in the 1970s and 80s, it was starting to become sort of an epicenter for the LGBT neighborhood community. Informally, you might have called it the gayborhood at the time, but it had lots of LGBT artists, and there were progressive activists, and if that's what you were looking for, this was definitely the place where you would come to find it. This is also where the Pride Parade historically has been held. However, that has changed a little bit in the past few years, and I'll talk a little bit more about Pride and the parade in a bit, because we do have World Pride, which is a big international event coming up soon. It is going to be hosted in Washington, D.C. this year in 2025. And actually, by the time I get around to editing and publishing this video, World Pride may have already started. So it is scheduled to start on May 17th this year. You will sometimes hear people refer to Dupont Circle as a diplomatic area. There are a lot of embassies in this neighborhood. I haven't really noticed or pointed out any yet, but if I do come across one, I will point it out so that you can see what an embassy might look like in the area. There's a section of DC called Embassy Row, and specifically, this is a section of Massachusetts Avenue, a bit west of where we are right now. It's where a lot of kind of prominent countries have their embassies, like the UK and Japan and Italy, but it is not the only place in DC where there are embassies. It is not the only place where you're allowed to have embassies. That's another misconception. Sometimes people think, oh, embassies are only allowed to be in this part of the city. And that's simply not true. The Canadian embassy, perhaps the best example of that, is located right next to the US Capitol. As tour guides, we used to talk about how that was a show of friendship between the two countries, although at the moment, I feel a little bit less certain about saying that. We'll see. But that is an example of one that's not located here. The Embassy of Mexico, another example of one that's not located in this neighborhood necessarily. If you're curious about embassies, I am by no means an expert on them, but DC Design Tours does a really good Embassy Row tour, so if you're interested, you can check that out. It is more of a niche tour, but if that is a niche that you're interested in, it might be a good tour for you. What I find fascinating about embassies is that they range from basically these huge compounds. For example, the German embassy, which is about 2.5 miles away from here, is this huge compound. It has multiple buildings. It has the ambassador's residence. It has an office building where the embassy staff works. It has grounds where they have events, and it's just a huge, massive place. I feel like a lot of US embassies in other countries are probably like that as well. But then you also have embassies that are basically just repurposed houses. So at one point it was somebody's house, and then at some point country so-and-so bought it and they turned it into their Washington, D.C. embassy. And in many cases, if you didn't know it was an embassy or you didn't notice a foreign flag flying out front, you might not even know because it really just blends right in with all the other houses. So I think that is pretty interesting. That is a very loud and a bit annoying truck right there. But as we continue to make our way down the street, I'm going to turn when we get up to 17th Street. You can see why I call Dupont Circle an everything neighborhood, because we have on the right a school, we have a playground. Across the street on the left is a big apartment building. So it's not just the historic, classic DC row houses. There are apartments, there's condos. I knew someone who, actually I've known multiple people who have owned studio condos in this neighborhood. And so what's cool about that is that if you can't afford a row house, and I certainly can't, and I know many people cannot, but you still really, really want to live in the neighborhood, there are options. There are many options. So you don't, and even if you don't want to buy something, if you just want to rent something, you can rent an apartment in this neighborhood. Because a lot of the buildings in this neighborhood are older, they are, not the most modern. They don't have all the fancy amenities like the pool on the roof or the things that landlords can use to charge more for the building. So we've now turned on 17th Street, and 17th Street is historically, and specifically this section of 17th Street, kind of the epicenter of LGBT culture in the neighborhood and in Washington, D.C. So we have the Pride Parade that typically takes place in June, and it will take place in June again this year, specifically on June 7th, 2025, but it will be mixed in with that World Pride International event that I was telling you about. And the Pride Parade used to have a route through the neighborhood. It started on P Street, kind of right near that Residence Inn I showed you earlier. It cut right through the Circle, past the fountain, and then it followed a route up to 17th Street. It came down 17th, the same way I'm walking right now, and then it turned back onto P Street. And people liked this route because it was very, for lack of a better term, neighborhoody. It felt like it was really integrated into the neighborhood. It went past people's houses. It went past people's apartment balconies. I know people who had balconies overlooking the parade route used to have these elaborate house parties on the day of the Pride Parade where all their friends would come over and watch the parade and just have a fun time. So recently, they have changed the route over to 14th Street. So the route now basically starts at 14th and U. It goes south on 14th Street to Pennsylvania Avenue, and then it turns left on Pennsylvania Avenue and goes towards the Capitol, the U.S. Capitol. A lot of people are frankly not fond of this change. 14th Street has more space for a big parade. 14th Street is a more commercial neighborhood, but it just, like I said, feels less neighborhoody. Now I wanted to turn down Q Street because this building that I'm highlighting right now is extremely important, not just for Dupont Circle, but for all of Washington, D.C. history. This is the Cairo. Why does this building matter? Well, it's because the Cairo is the reason, this building is the reason why there are no tall buildings, no skyscrapers in Washington, D.C. When it was built and when it opened in 1894, it was called Washington, D.C.'s first skyscraper. It was the tallest residential building in the city. Does it look like a skyscraper to you? Well, compared to everything else around it, and from that angle I just shot it at, probably a little bit. Looks like a skyscraper. But compared to any other city, compared to Chicago, compared to Manhattan, compared to Omaha, Nebraska's downtown, no, it does not look like a skyscraper. But it is, or it was, considered a skyscraper when it opened in the 1890s, and because of it, we have the Height of Buildings Act, which was Congress's restriction on the height of buildings. Essentially, the actual law has a lot of nuances, but the basic premise is buildings cannot be taller than the street that they are on, the width of the street that they're on, plus 20 feet, with some exceptions. So that's why we don't have any tall buildings in DC. This big elephant, this is in front of PETA. Love them or hate them, you probably know what PETA is. I believe that's one of their office buildings. And here is an example of an embassy. Let's take a peek. Do you recognize that flag? Unless you're really into flags, or you're really into diplomacy or geopolitics, you probably don't. This is the Embassy of Kurdistan. The Embassy of Kurdistan. So a great example of a country that has a building that basically blends into the fabric of the neighborhood. Very, very different from the big compounds that you'll find at the Embassy of Germany or the Embassy of the United Kingdom, which are these giant, I can't really think of a better word to describe them other than compounds, although that doesn't really sound particularly attractive. So let's turn right here. There's not really anything down this street, but I do want to go this way because it gives me a chance to show you an example of a Washington, D.C. alley. Now, I know people, they hear alley and they don't think, alleys typically don't bring up positive emotions in people. I think people here think of alleys as dark, dangerous places where shady stuff happens. And I'm not saying that's never true. There's probably some alleys that are a little bit sketchier than others, but this is Dupont Circle. I am fascinated by alleys. They serve a really interesting purpose. They were part of the original plan for Washington, D.C. Almost all neighborhoods in the original city, the L'Enfant city, have alleys. And this is very different from, say, New York City, specifically Manhattan, which was planned almost exclusively without alleys. So a lot of things happen in the alleys. You have access to buildings. For example, here on the right, you have these garages. So I'm not sure exactly what buildings these are, but you have, if you're driving into the building, you can drive into the garage. You have these big garbage bins. You have some parking spaces. This is more of a commercial alley, so residential alleys might look a little bit different than this, but this is the kind of alley you might expect behind a business rather than a residence, with the big dumpsters and such. Now, the reason why this is all so significant and fascinating to me is because when I give tours, when I'm giving tours to people, a lot of times people are taking these multi-city trips around the US, and they will have just come from New York City, or at some point in their trip they've been in New York City. And when I ask them what they think of Washington, D.C., and if I ask them specifically what they think of Washington, D.C. compared to New York City, they will often say it's much cleaner. It's a much cleaner city. And I want to unpack this because, again, I find this fascinating. When someone says that Washington, D.C. is cleaner, I think there's two things that are going on. The first is that the garbage in Washington, D.C. typically goes in the dumpster, in the alley, behind the building. And because most tourists are not going into the alley behind the building, they never notice it. They never notice the garbage. Whereas in Manhattan, there are no alleys, and up until recently, they barely even had garbage bins at all. And so the garbage would just go right on the street, right on the sidewalk, right out front. And so you'd be walking down the street or the avenue in Manhattan, and there would just be piles and piles and piles of garbage. And yes, that is not a good look. It is not attractive. And not only that, but where there's garbage, there's rodents, there's vermin. When you have the garbage in a bin or in a dumpster, it's much easier to control the vermin. When it's just right out in bags on the sidewalk, a little bit less so. The other thing is that Washington, D.C. has a lot of business improvement districts, or BIDs. And these are basically you can think of them as like little mini governments. So you have the District of Columbia, city government, and then within those you have these BIDs. And the BIDs are, I suppose their primary purpose is to serve the businesses in the area, but really they serve everyone who is a stakeholder in the neighborhood. So in many BIDs, the businesses pay into it, the people who live there pay into it, there's like a special tax. You can basically think of it as this group of neighbors, this group of businesses has come together and decided we are going to voluntarily pay an extra tax so that we can have extra amenities in our neighborhood. And perhaps the most important amenity is garbage collection and garbage removal. So you'll often see, for example, in the Dupont Circle BID, or the Golden Triangle BID, which is next door, or the Georgetown BID, you will see people with garbage bins, and they're in uniforms, and they're emptying the trash cans, and they have those little pickers that they walk around and pick up trash with. And this makes, in my opinion, such a significant difference. So it's really hard to describe it without without showing both side by side, and I don't really have any footage for this, but there are some neighborhoods in DC that are not part of a bid. They don't have it. And it just feels dirtier. It just feels grimier. It also happens that most of the places where tourists go when they come to Washington, D.C. are part of those bids. So whether that's, like I said, the downtown bid, the Georgetown bid, the Capitol Riverfront bid, if you're going over for a baseball or a soccer game, it's just going to feel cleaner. It's not going to feel as dirty, as grimy as some other neighborhoods might. But in my opinion, the difference is noticeable and the difference is significant. So I just wanted to point that out. I wanted to show you that alley so that you can see why people have this observation about Washington, D.C. Sorry, I got distracted. It sounds like bagpipes. Sounds like there are someone bagpiping, perhaps, across the street. I'm gonna stop talking. I'm gonna try to edit the volume up so you can hear. Yeah, no idea why there is a lone bagpiper out on the street corner. But hey, you know, that's one of the wonderful things about living in the city or visiting the city is that sometimes you're just walking down the street and you come across a lone bagpiper. So if anyone has any idea why this person would be out here bagpiping on a day like today, leave a comment and let me know because I am quite curious. Or maybe it's just someone who wanted to get out and play. So I'm going to make my way down New Hampshire Avenue, back towards the circle, and we're getting close to the end, and I still haven't fully addressed why there's no water in the fountain, in the Dupont Circle fountain. So, like I said, the original Dupont Circle had a statue of Dupont in the middle, and that was later replaced with the fountain that now stands today. And it's actually a very nice fountain. I'm going to edit on either a photo or a video, I'm not quite sure what I have available, of the Dupont Circle fountain when it's working. And when it's working is really the key thing with this fountain. Fountains in Washington, D.C., unfortunately, are just absolutely prone to mechanical failure, mechanical difficulties. Oh, here's another hotel, the Dupont Circle Hotel. I believe that's an Irish flag flying out front, and I believe the reason is because it's an Irish company that owns it. Oh, and before I finish with the fountain, this red thing right here, so this is a stairwell. It leads to an area called the Dupont Underground. Fascinating art space. Not open very often. Definitely go to that website that's printed right there. Go to the Dupont Underground website and see if there is anything happening while you're in town, because it's not used very often, but it is a very cool space. Bit of a forgotten space. Dupont Circle and many of the local neighborhood city parks in Washington, D.C. are under jurisdiction of the National Park Service. And if you're thinking, wait, isn't that the same government agency that runs the Grand Canyon and Yellowstone and Yosemite? Yes, it is. And that's why it's a bit of an odd situation, because the National Park Service, I'm sure, is fantastic at operating these massive, huge rural parks. But operating an urban park, a small one like Dupont Circle, it's a completely different ballgame. And not only that, but I've talked recently in a podcast episode from a few months back about what's going on in the federal government, and Elon Musk coming in the past few months and taking a chainsaw to the federal government and the people who work there, the civil servants who work for the federal government. And the National Park Service was not exempt. We had park rangers fired, we had maintenance staff fired, and it's really hard for me to see how this is going to make anything better. Because from my perspective, we still have all the same problems we've all had, and if anything, fewer people to help resolve them. So I don't want to end too negatively, just to say that that is how it is. If you're interested in Dupont Circle, I have an entire guide to this neighborhood, so check that out next. And, as I say at the end of all of these, enjoy your trip.